Purely geographically, these bastards were in an extremely advantageous position. Russian troops easily reached Kazan and Astrakhan along the Volga, but the Crimea was separated from the then Russian borders by a wild field, a wide, deserted steppe. There was simply no place to get provisions for people, water, food for horses and baggage animals. The only road to the Crimea, moreover, led through a narrow isthmus Perekop, so named for good reason. The Turks there at one time dug a deep moat up to 30 meters deep, built a powerful fortress with 20 towers, and in addition, along the moat the width of the Perekop was a little more than 7 kilometers, they put 7 stone towers with 5 guns each. Exactly. Turks. Any serious Russian invasion of Crimea would inevitably lead to war with Turkey. And for a serious war with the Ottoman Empire, which Moscow perfectly understood, there were still not enough forces. However, this does not mean that Russia has been sitting idly by. There were other methods of influencing the Crimea. More on this later. The first and only Russian military campaign in the Crimea in the 16th century took place in 1559 year. However, for the sake of observing the historical truth, this enterprise, although quite successful, should still be called not a campaign, but a raid. Kostroma nobleman Daniil Adashev built several boats, put an 8,000th army on them, went down the Dnieper, captured 2 Turkish warships, then, having landed his people on the shore, smashed nearby Crimean villages for 2 weeks, captured a lot of loot, freed a lot of prisoners. Having received the news that Tatar strong cavalry had moved against him, and Turkish warships were moving by sea, Adashev returned home safely with all the loot and the liberated regiment. Adashev had a brother, who, together with the priest Sylvester, headed the so-called elected Rada, a government body created by Grozny and close to him personally. Thus, Grozny belittled the former Boyar Duma, over which the Rada now stood. Both Sylvester and Adashev were fanatical supporters of the war with Crimea and its capture, which was constantly persuaded by Grozny, especially after the successful campaign of Adashev Jr. Vulgarly speaking, they ate the king's bald head with their whining, "Father, dear father, go to war with the Basarmans." Only Grozny was much smarter and more farsighted than his companions. He remembered perfectly well that between the southern borders of the Moscow kingdom and the Crimean possessions there was a wild field that had already been mentioned more than once, stretching for 1,400 kilometers, almost deserted thickets and vast steppes, where there were very few water sources, and there was nowhere to take provisions and no one. So, the army sent to the Crimea would have to take every bucket of water, every handful of oats for horses and cereals for people, every horseshoe carnation with them. But this is not the main problem. The main problem was that any large-scale invasion of Crimea would automatically mean war with Turkey. In Crimea, as we remember, there were strong Turkish garrisons, and Perekop was seriously fortified. Moreover, Turkey, which had a large military fleet, could often and regularly transfer troops, ammunition, and everything necessary to the Crimea in case of war. The Turkey of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent was extremely strong at that time. And finally, the main Russian forces were thrown into the Livonian War. At first, things were going well for the Russians. The once mighty Livonian order has turned into a veritable farce. In addition to the order itself, or rather its remnants, there was also an archdiocese and 4 bishoprics. They owned castles, cities, lands, recognized only the authority of the Pope over themselves. But since the Pope lived on the other side of Europe, there was no control over the 5 clerics. In addition, there were about 1,500 knights in Livonia who owned lands and castles. Theoretically, each of them was a vassal of either the order or one of the 5 high clerics, but in practice, he was independent because of the general confusion and the lack of a strong central government. And in addition, some large cities enjoyed considerable autonomy and self-government, which they liked to demonstrate to the order and clergy on business and without business. The fuel was added by the fact that the knights, clergy and townspeople consisted almost exclusively of Germans, with a small admixture of Poles. And the ancestors of the current Estonians, Latvians, and part of the Lithuanians were completely disenfranchised serfs, who often rose up in revolts. Some Livonian cities joined the Protestants, and Catholic churches began to be smashed there, and at the same time, without making any special distinctions, Orthodox churches. A quarrel began between Catholics and Protestants. Moreover, the Catholics were joined by both, angered by the pogrom of their churches, and the Orthodox. The order was at war with the Archbishop of Dorpat because of some nonsense. Someone, who remained an unknown big story, slapped the Polish ambassador. The Polish king came with an army, and the Poles began to beat everyone in a row. Then they returned home, but they managed to arrange a lot of ruin. So the troops of Grozny, who invaded the territory of this madhouse, quickly and without much difficulty, took a large city, and a strong fortress of Polotsk, occupied vast territories in the western and northwestern regions of Russia. However, Sweden and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Poland, and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which had united by that time, entered the game. Moreover, the Polish-Lithuanian army was led personally by King Stephen Batory, the Hungarian magnate Stefan Batory, a talented commander, actually elected by the Polish king. The situation has changed dramatically. The war has become protracted and extremely bloody. Moreover, by the time of Adashev's campaign, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which had not yet united with Poland, began negotiations on a military alliance with the Crimean Khan, fearing that Grozny for good would indeed seize the Crimea, after which he would have his hands free in the west against Lithuania. The piquancy consisted in the fact that Daniil Adashev seized the documents about these negotiations in the Crimea, and innocently handed them over to Grozny, not suspecting that he had thereby planted a fair pig to his brother. Grozny immediately used the documents as a trump card in his favor against the utopian plans of Sylvester S. Adashev. Pre-revolutionary Russian historian, descendant of the Little Russian Flakhtich Kostomarev. We will meet this curious figure again. He proceeded with poisonous saliva at one time, condemning the stupidity of the terrible, who, through his stupidity, did not appreciate the brilliant plan of Sylvester and Adashev, completely not understanding what the terrible perfectly understood. The real chances of Russia's victory in the war with the Ottoman Empire are zero. However, already under Grozny, a great tool was found to fight the Basarmans, and the Turks and Tatars suffered significant damage, and Russia remained, as it were, on the sidelines with absolutely nothing to do. We are talking about the Don Cossacks, who by that time had already created the Don army, which was absolutely subordinate to no one. It was they who fought for a long time and tirelessly with the Tatars and Turks. There were not enough forces for a serious war, and therefore, the Don people, often together with the Cossacks, used tactics that later, in the 20th century, the military would call mosquito. They attacked suddenly, tried to inflict as much damage as possible, and loot as much as possible, in the shortest possible time, after which they retreated just as quickly. In the Russian archives, there are many complaints to the Moscow Tsars from the Crimean Khan and the Turkish Sultan about the actions of the Don Cossacks. Here the Khan is crying, "Your Cossacks, passing by the Don, are calling for a Skoda, and since this summer, your Cossacks, having come twice, have gone to Azov and the Skoda student." Anyone who remembers the excellent adventure film The Golden River should also remember the remarkable conversation between the underground gold digger, former officer Zimin, and the main negative character Efim Saturday. Did your people ambush me at Kuruma last year? Are you an officer, if I'm the Lord God, talking about my people? They are all God's people. Moscow responded to the Basarman wives in approximately the same style. On the Don, there are free people, Russian fugitives, on whom lies the disgrace of the sovereign. There are no Cossacks on the Don, and our sovereign fugitive people live there arbitrarily, without our knowledge. In a word, gentlemen Hanna and Sultan deal with these self-willed themselves. And Russia has no means of influencing the violent freemen simply. At the same time, the Moscow Tsars sent considerable money to the Don, as well as whole carts, bread, wine, gunpowder, lead, sulfur, kernels, canvases and cloth. But it was done completely unofficially, without any paperwork, so there was no written evidence left. The Turkish Sultan is already complaining to Moscow. The Cossacks took away all his wool in Azov. The Cossacks from Azov will pay the rent and will not let them drink water from the Don. The Russian ambassador in Istanbul, Boris Blagolo, threw up his hands, shrugged his shoulders, and with an honest face, told the Sultan's diplomat, "These people are disgraced fugitives from Russia and other states, of which some have grown old on the Don, live near Azov arbitrarily and not according to the sovereign, and they have a quarrel with the Azovians and the Crimeans, especially because the Azovians, the Crimeans, the Kossacks, and the Divive children, people go to war in Ukraine. That is, the outskirts of the sovereign take the inhabitants captive and take them to Azov, and that the Cossacks, unable to tolerate it, attack the Azovians and the Crimeans, although the sovereign confirms to them that they and the Azovians live quietly, and do not come to the Crimean Ulysses. This is a soft diplomatic hint that the Crimeans themselves were rummaging in the fluff. Another Sultan's complaint is flying to Moscow. Yes, your Cossacks, Kishkin, comrades live under our city of Azov, and our people are being squeezed along the Azov tracts, and many losses are being repaired, and they are being robbed and beaten, and you would have to calm those people down. Unfortunately, neither the Russian nor the Turkish archives have preserved the Moscow answer, but without a doubt, it was designed in the same style. Cossacks, where people are free, sovereigns vozlishniki, and the king can't do anything about them, you can handle it yourself. The piquancy is that Ataman Kishkin was directly on the Tsar's salary. The Tsar's charter has been preserved, which instructs Moscow representatives on the Don to act together with the Ataman with Ivan Kishkin, and with other Atamans and Cossacks who serve the Tsar. This, of course, is direct evidence, but neither the Tatars nor the Turks have ever got their hands on this letter, nor the Russian residents on the Don. So the Russian ambassadors in Bakhchisaray and Istanbul continued to throw up their hands innocently, and assure that the Cossacks were acting solely on their own initiative. And the Don Cossacks, as already mentioned, often worked together with the Cossacks, constantly and extremely audaciously. They were dissatisfied with the fact that every now and then they smashed Tatar ulus in the Crimea, and built fortified towns near the Crimean borders. They also often arranged sea trips. Turkish penal servitude, military galleys and large multi-gun sailing ships were opposed by the Cossack mosquito fleet. Canoes and seagulls, large boats, in addition to sails, equipped with oars and even armed with falconet cannons. These guns were small, about half a meter long. They certainly could not resist the Turkish naval guns, but at close range they could still whip with buckshot, so it would not seem enough to anyone. Falconets were quite suitable against unarmed Turkish merchant ships, which the Cossacks often intercepted in the Black Sea. Historians have documented for 1614th–1645 years, more than 20 only large raids of Donets and Zaporozhtzi on the Turkish shores, and the number of small ones does not lend itself to accounting. There is no written information about them, but it is known that there were a lot of them. Back in 1569 year, the Russian ambassador to the Crimea reported to Moscow that the Don Cossacks had torn a fair amount of gunpowder from the wall surrounding Azov, and because of that, the wall was torn out of the city, and the courtyards in the city, and many people were burned, and the outfit and the stock and the courts were burned. The Tsar sent his secret envoy Nikita Mamin to the Don with a letter signed with his own hand. When Mamin comes to the Don and announces our cause to you, then unite with him, think unanimously about our benefits, and be sure of our mercy and salary to you. And again, neither this letter nor Mamin himself fell into the hands of the Basarmans. And what our business was, it quickly became clear from another complaint of the Turkish Sultan. The Cossacks not only attacked Azov again, but captured it for a short time, taking captive not only 20 of the best people of Azov, but also the Sultan's brother-in-law, Sarin, who unfortunately found himself in the city. According to the established tradition, a standard unsubscription was received from Moscow. All sorts of things are done between the Azov people of the Don Cossacks, both peaceful and abusive, without our knowledge. That there is some kind of Azov, in fact, a third-rate fortress, albeit strategically important. In 1614th year, the Cossacks unexpectedly struck at Sinop, the most important naval fortress of the Ottoman Empire, located on the Turkish coast of the Black Sea. The local garrison was killed, the Turkish ships standing in the harbor were burned. In 1616th year, they repeated this expedition, staged a night assault, captured the city, looted and burned it. 60 galleys of the Turkish Coast Guard were launched in pursuit. They overtook the Cossacks near the mouth of the Don, but after a short naval battle, the main forces of the Cossacks broke through and left. The Turks got only a small part of the loot and 40 people. In 1616th year, the Donets and Zaporozhtsi under the command of Hetman Sagaidakhny attacked Kaffa, not only the strongest Turkish fortress in the Crimea, but also the largest center of the slave trade. The city was taken, a lot of Turkish galleys standing in the port were burned, a considerable number of prisoners were freed and left with impunity. In some areas of Crimea, the attack of the Cossacks led to the fact that, as Russian envoys who were passing through those places reported, in those places, in villages and villages, all sorts of people fled from the Cossacks and live in the forests. In the same way, a little later, the residents of Kaffa, barely hearing about the approach of the Cossack flotilla, grabbed their wives and children, all the property they could carry away, and fled in great numbers to the surrounding area. This is an interesting situation that developed in the 16th century. On the one hand, the Ottoman Empire remained the strongest power in the region and dominated the Black Sea. On the other hand, a flotilla of Cossack canoes and seagulls intercepted Turkish merchant sea caravans throughout the century, sometimes even captured single military vessels, and every now and then burned towns and villages on the Turkish coast. It got to the point that Constantinople itself did not feel safe either. 1615th year, the Cossack flotilla burned Turkish ships in 2 harbors near Constantinople. 1623rd year, 6,000 Cossacks reappeared near the Turkish capital, not just devastated the neighborhood, but even captured 2 city blocks, from where they were driven out with great difficulty by the Sultan's troops. 1624th year, Cossacks on 150 canoes destroyed and plundered the suburb of the Turkish capital, burned the lighthouse at the entrance to the Bosphorus, and left with impunity from the rich booty. Of course, not all terraces of these dashing raids were successful. Sometimes on the way back, Turkish warships intercepted the Cossacks, more than once inflicted significant losses. Well, in general, not only the Crimea, but also the Turkish Empire were literally terrorized by the Kazan raids, in an amount, as already mentioned, that could not be accurately accounted for. Moscow had nothing to do with it every time, and from Persia, the local Padishah looked at the Cossack raids with a cynical smile and undoubted pleasure. Turkey and Persia lived like a cat with a dog, and fought with each other often. The Turks received a short respite in the 30s of the same 16th century. Russia was then waging a long and difficult war for Smolensk with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and it was extremely important for Moscow to ensure the neutrality of Turkey and the Crimean Khanate. The Tsarist ambassadors on the Don used all their influence and eloquence, probably backed up by hard currency, to convince the Donets to abandon the raids on the Tatars of the Turks for the time being. Influential Don atamans agreed to this. They could not keep separate detachments of violent freemen from raids either, but all major sea raids temporarily moved to the Caspian Sea against Persia. Now the ambassadors of the Persian Shah complained in Moscow about the Don robbers, and from Moscow they habitually replied that this violent free woman had nothing to do with Russia, lived by her wool, fought with whom she wanted, and the Tsar was not able to do anything with them. Now the Turkish Sultan, who was just at war with Persia for Baghdad, was grinning maliciously. But he didn't grin for long. The Persian campaigns lasted less than 2 years, no more. Russia did not receive not only Turkey's help in the war against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but also the neutrality of the Crimea. In the midst of the battles for Smolensk, the Crimean Khan made another serious raid on the southern regions of Russia. To repel it, part of the troops had to be pulled out of Smolensk and the voivode Shane did not take the city. In Moscow, they got really angry and gave the go-ahead to the Donets. They returned from the Caspian Sea, received a considerable salary, a banner from the Tsar, and again with great pleasure, began to attack the Tatars and Turks. And on the 9th of April, 1637th year, the date in history is recorded exactly, the big Cossack circle of the Don army decided to take Azov. Because where a lot of dirty things are being done to the Russian state, and our yurts and settlements, from that city of Azov. And the free Cossacks made a covenant among themselves to go to Azovgrad and die for the faith of the Orthodox Tsar. Azov was planted in the Cossack, according to all the rules, dug in ditches, brought to the very walls of the trench, built a fortification. Where they suddenly got such a skill, one can only guess. Simply, the guys must have been capable. Moscow, as always, of course, had nothing to do with it, but a certain Stepan Chirikov sailed from Russia on several river vessels, brought cannons, 100 pounds of gunpowder, 100 pounds of lead, and 4,200 cannonballs, and at the same time, the famous Don Ataman Ivan the convict, who quickly gathered and brought reinforcements to Azov. However, a long artillery bombardment of the fortress did not lead to anything. The fortress walls, built by the Genos, were too thick and strong. Only guns of a particularly large caliber could cope with them, as they said then, a battering outfit, but neither the Cossacks, nor, apparently, Moscow had them. We decided to act differently. An extremely mysterious figure appeared, a Cossack named Ivan, but, as one of the eyewitnesses of the events wrote, he came from German soil. Then it's even more interesting. And Ataman Mikhailo Ivanov, and the whole great army of the Don, taught Ivan to beat his forehead, so that he could dig under that hail of Azov, under the wall. The mysterious Ivan led the digs. It took quite a lot of time and work, but the result was worth it. Having brought the tunnel to the wall itself, Cossack Ivan from the German lands blew up powder charges. A huge gap was formed in the wall, into which Ataman Mikhailo Ivanov immediately burst with Donets and Zaporozhtsi. On the opposite side, many ladders were placed against the walls, and stormtroopers began to climb them, who quickly penetrated into the city. The great siege lasted until the evening, after which the defenders of Azov, rightly considering themselves defeated, began to climb over the wall and escape into the steppe. However, they were intercepted by mounted Donets near the Kogalnik River, and cut down every single one of them. Azov was taken, although minor battles continued in it for another week. Some of the residents settled in the towers and stone shopping malls, fighting back to the last. As for the mysterious Ivan, I personally have strong suspicions that it was simply a German engineer hired by the Russians, a specialist in mine blasting. So, Azov was taken. But then, serious difficulties began for all interested parties. The Cossacks were well aware that they could not hold the fortress on their own, without the help of Moscow. Moscow hesitated, fearing a serious conflict with Turkey. Therefore, they limited themselves to sending the Donets another salary. But there was no talk of the sovereigns taking Azov under their arm. The Turkish ambassadors who arrived were habitually explained that Moscow, as usual, had nothing to do with it, and the Cossacks, according to their usual custom, took Azov arbitrarily by their theft. The Turks pretended to believe. At that time, Turkey was up to its ears in another big war with Persia, and the Sultan did not yet want to openly quarrel with Russia, and did not have enough troops at his disposal to throw them to Azov. However, in order to do at least something, he ordered to go to Azov to the Crimean Khan Bagadurgiri, which led the Khan and his nobles into serious despondency. They were well aware of the hopeless enterprise they were being pushed into. To take a powerful fortress with light cavalry is completely unrealistic. A certain Mirza Sulshev openly cried to the Russian envoy, "What should the Dinas do with the dose? A Tatar, where there is nothing to do under the city, is not a city where we are. At least put a thin wooden town, and there's nothing we can do. Azov is a stone city, we won't do anything to it." However, the Sultan's command had to be carried out, even if it cracked, otherwise the Khan could lose the throne of the nobleman of heads. Having sighed, Bagadurgiri nevertheless led a cavalry army to Azov, without a single cannon. He did not even try to storm the city, he sent his Mirs there, who began to promise the Cossacks a lot of money for the surrender of the city. The Cossacks sent Mirs for mother. After standing under the walls for about a month, the Crimean Khan took his army home. It happened in the autumn of 1638th year. Until the summer of 1641st year, the Cossacks sat quietly in Azov. The Turks needed time to prepare a serious campaign. The war with Persia was over, and they could now use large military forces. Here Sultan Murat IV died, rather inopportunely for the Turks, and the campaign had to be postponed. Only in the summer of 1641st year, a strong Turkish-Tatar army appeared at the Kol Wall. There have been disputes with historians about its number for a long time. The Turks called the figure of 250,000 people, but this is clearly a combat fiction. It is believed that a more modest amount is closest to the truth. From 50 to 70,000 people. In any case, the forces were blatantly unequal. According to accurate information reported to Moscow by the Cossacks themselves, there were only 5,367 besieged people. The main part of the Turkish army was made up of Jenikars, well-trained and armed infantry with extensive combat experience, elite Turkish units of that time. The Turks brought with them a lot of siege gun scrap Audi. In addition, about 6,000 European mercenaries arrived with them, who had experience in taking fortresses. The Cossacks then reported back to Moscow. The German city dwellers, wise fictionalists of many states, who know how to invent all sorts of criminal deeds and dig up the land and fire incendiary kernels, have mined with pashas for all kinds of criminal and underground crafts. In a word, the situation of the besieged seemed hopeless, but it happened otherwise. The defense of Azov, later called the Great Seat, became one of the brightest pages of the military glory of the Don Cossack army. The Turks tried everything that the military science of that time was capable of. After a fierce artillery bombardment, they attacked, but were repulsed, suffering huge losses. Moreover, the besieged made a sortie and crushed a lot of the retreating. Then the Turks, having stood idle for 2 days after an unsuccessful assault, decided to use the European one. Pour a huge earthen rampart flush with the city wall, put guns on it, and then, pouring sand, bring the rampart close to the walls and already break into the city along it. We worked for 3 days. On the 4th, Cossacks staged an unexpected sortie. There were no Turkish soldiers near the work site, and the unarmed builders simply fled. Having seized 28 barrels of gunpowder, the Cossacks blew up that high mountain with them, though not immediately. They waited until the Turkish janissaries came running, and only then retreated for watering 1,400 janissaries will die. The Turks did not try to build a rampart anymore, that their wisdom and earthy has since passed. They went on a second attack, and again unsuccessfully. The underground war began. The Turks brought approaches to the city walls themselves, but the Cossacks led their own towards them, and either grappled with the enemy underground, or undermined the powder charges installed by the Turks, or laid their own. And in addition, they dug 28 underground passages to the Turkish camp, from where they arranged unexpected hairs. New bombardments, new unsuccessful assaults, the Cossacks held on. But the morale of the Turkish army was undermined. 43 attacks ended unsuccessfully. Shooting from 9 guns did not achieve results. Autumn was approaching with rains and bad weather, and the bleak prospect of being stuck under the walls of Azov until winter. The janissaries murmured little by little. The Crimean cavalry all this time, stuck in inactivity near the throat. The Turkish pashas, like huskies on bears, attacked the Khan, demanding that his people participate in the attacks. The Khan firmly replied, "He knows the Cossacks, you can't take them by storm. Cossacks are hard-hearted people in sieges." And he refused to fight categorically.